Good morning, dear ladies. Today we are going to start with a revision of the Neoclassicism or the school of Neoclassical in poetry and in literature. You remember that you have already studied Alexander Pope, whose work was depending on the revival of of the classics. And the word neoclassicism is a combination of two words, neo and the classic. The word neo has been derived from a Greek word, which is neos, which means young or new, while the word classic, according to the Webster Dictionary, refers to the style and works of the ancient authors of Greece and Rome. To combine these words, we get the meaning of neoclassicism as the rebirth or revival and restoration of classical works. Of course, this school was first used in reviving the architect and the artful works of the Romans and the Greeks, because they show a great extent of artifice and beauty. Neoclassicism is a movement in the history of English literature which led immense emphasis on the revival of classical spirit during the period between 1680 and 1750 in the age of Alexander Pope and John Dryden, which is also known as the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment. This neoclassicism is a prototype. It means a typical copy of classicism. Writers of this period immensely endeavored to follow the footpaths of the writers of the period of Augustus, Emperor of Rome, which produced unparalleled writers as Horace, Virgil, and Ovid. That is the reason why this age of Dryden and Pope is also called the Augustan age, because it refers to Augustus, the Emperor of Rome, because they are reviving the literature of that period. Neoclassicism developed with the Enlightenment, which is also called the Age of Reason, which is in fact the 18th century. This word enlightenment means what? It refers to a political and philosophical movement that primarily valued science and reason and exploration and emphasized merely and strongly moral virtues. Neoclassicism developed as a reaction to the Renaissance style of poetry that was an outcome of fancy and imagination. We all know that during the Renaissance, the writers and artists were all concerned with imagination, with fancy, with beauty. They were escaping their reality to the world of fancy and imagination. While the Augustan age writers like Dryden and Pope, they were emphasizing that whatever we discuss in literature should be relying on reality more than imagination. Now, what are the characteristics of neoclassical poetry? We have to know what are the characteristics of neoclassical poetry. First of all, rationality. Since neoclassical poets believe that reason is the mainspring of learning, we have to learn through our reason, and it is the mainspring of knowledge and inspiration. So they did not believe they didn't believe that literature should rely on imagination or sentiments. The neoclassical poetry simulated, fabricated, and stereotypical type of poetry. Unlike romantic poetry, in romantic poetry we find that writers and poets, especially poets, were depending strongly on imagination and sentiments of the poets, and they consider these two elements, or these elements which are fanciful, are vital elements in their poetry, while the neoclassical poetry depends on, or considers that reason and intellect are the dominant, or are supposed to be the dominant elements in writing poetry. The second point, the second feature of the neoclassical poetry is that it should be classical and it depends on classical and scholarly allusions. Classical poets were all highly educated. I mean the classical ones, the Virgil, Ovid, Horace, Homer. All these writers were Greek and Romans. They were all highly educated. They know in various fields of knowledge. They know a lot of things about religion, biblical and classical literature. So this knowledge served their love. I mean, the neoclassical poets, they used this knowledge to serve their love to use biblical and scholarly allusions in their poetry. We find there are, you know what is allusion? It means that we refer to examples from scholarly works and from the Bible. So they like to make these references to show their knowledge and to show their let's say controlling learning. The fifth feature is adherence to classical rules. Adherence means التصاق. They want the neoclassical poets. They had a great interest in the in the classical literature and the classical works and the forms followed by the classical writers, the rules followed by the classical writers, and they wanted to apply these rules and norms in their writing. And that's why the classical poets were keen to follow each and every rule of classicism, employing them as much as possible in their poetry. Why did Alexander Pope use this type of couplets? Because he wanted to criticize the trivial things done by great families or noble families, and they build on these trivial things. Some quarrels and some disasters might happen, so he wanted to criticize these trivialities they follow, and in an attempt to instruct them, in an attempt to teach them that what you are doing is not correct. The seventh point is that, or the seventh feature of neoclassical poetry is that you don't have any passionate lyricism. Using lyrics is depending on emotions, is depending on feelings, because you know lyrics means الشعر الوجداني أو الشعر العاطفي أو الشعر الغنائي. Lyrics are used usually to articulate emotions, to articulate passion. Okay, so if the neoclassical poets, even when they used lyrics, they didn't include passion in their lyrics. They looked at passion with distrust and suspicion. This led to avoiding using lyrics that lurk on passions and emotions, because these lyrics would set free the poet's imagination, and we know that neoclassical poets were against imagination, while we find that romantic poets were so much dwelling on the imaginative and passionate aspects of poetry, of life, while the neoclassists were dwelling on the intellectual aspects of poetry. Now, objectivity is another feature of neoclassicism. It means that we are avoiding to give vent, to give a relief, or to give a release to one's feelings. The neoclassical poets were completely against subjectivity in poetry. They were keen observers to their surroundings, but in a very objective eye, and the experiences they get is copied objectively in their poetry. They don't intrude their subjective feelings or emotions into their let's say judgments. Poetic diction. Poetic diction, it means the type of language that we use in writing our poems or our poetry. Poetic diction for neoclassical poets was very important. They were very conscious to use a different language for their poetry, different from what they use in prose. The language used in their poetry was rigid and concrete and never flexible. They believed that there must be a hard line drawn between the poetry and the prose in the use of language, concerning their use of language. The neoclassical doctrine was to show due obedience to correctness of form, imagery, and vocabulary. This means what? This means that they have to follow the rules and they have to use very correct images, very correct vocabularies, very correct form in writing their poetry. They didn't accept any flexible language in their poetry. And they considered that refined diction of verse, careful selection of metaphors, and tidy couplet form were very important, and these were exemplifying, for instance, Alexander Pope's writing. Now, these are the points which are mostly referred to by Alexander Pope as characteristic of neoclassical poetry in his essay on criticism. Now, Alexander Pope, as you have already studied last year, he wrote also an essay on man. What is his view of man? And this view of man, of course, is depending on the classical view of man. Alexander Pope offered observations on human limitations, passion, intelligence, sociability, and the potential for happiness. Now, he looks at man according to this scale. He looks at human limitations. He looks at part of his scale is how man is dealing with his passions, how man is using his intelligence, and how man or a human being can be sociable. It means agreed sociably or socially, and what is man's potential for happiness? How can man achieve his happiness? In his essay on man, Alexander Pope emphasized the concept of pervasive order. What is pervasive order? It means that man has a place in a vast chain of being, and in this vast chain of being, he must decide his relation as a human being to nature, his relation as a creature to other creatures, and his relation to God, his relation as a creature to his creator. Therefore, this observation led to the consideration that within the concept of correctness, this is very important, ladies, you have to pay attention for this. This observation that man is part of a chain of being, okay, led to the consideration that within the concept of correctness, if we want to be correct, everything should be judged within the realm of intelligence and being socially agreeable. It means what? It means if man wants to be judged as good or correct, he must take into consideration that he is going to be judged within 2 points. 1, his intelligence, and 2, to what extent he is agreed by his society. So later on, this scale was developed and to be comprehended later under the word of sentimental. You have to be sentimental in which way? Not to be sentimental in the meaning of feelings. No, you have to be sentimental. A word which started to have a reference to everything that is in vogue. يعني لازم تكون على الموضة، مقبول اجتماعيا, polite and clever, Okay, you have to be agreed by your society. So this started to be accorded to poetry discussing religious instructions and Jesus' sacrifice and eternity gained through virtuous torture. Now, since we have a shared compassion, so our literature is going to be a good literature in the neoclassical eyes. So this developed what tendency? That we started to discuss in our poetry as neoclassical poets. I mean, neoclassical poets started to discuss religion, and especially the religious instructions and Jesus' sacrifice as a way to get, let's say, to be saved and to get eternity. Following this collective sentimental celebration in poetry, some sentimental religious poetry as hymns and psalms were designed for communal musical expression rather than for the private reading. Now, discussing religion started to be revealed not only through reading but through presenting hymns and psalms, الترانيم، الأناشيد الدينية والمزامير. مزامير يعني قراءة آيات من الزبور لكن بشكل غنائي. Through a communal musical expression rather than for the private reading. All these hymns were moving toward a prevision of the eternal bliss and ultimate fulfillment in heaven. And these hymns were enjoyed by the community because they thought that they will fulfill their eternal bliss in heaven. But still, some issues which are also religious, but they are not related to immortality, they were related to mortality and death and the evils related to death. These issues were not appreciated and were not discussed. They were scarcely discussed. That is why some of the 18th century poets started to express a more somber, reflective, melancholic and moral predominance poetry. Okay? They were called the graveyard poets. The graveyard school is an 18th century genre that focuses on death and bereavement. The graveyard school consisted largely of imitations of Robert Blair's popular long poem of morbid appeal, The Grave, in 1743, and of Edward Young's celebrated blank verse dramatic rhapsody, Night Thoughts, in 1742 to 1745. These two poets, in fact writers, they were 18th century writers, but they chose to write about death. Okay? So their poems express the sorrow and pain of bereavement, evoke the horror of death's physical manifestations, and suggest the transitory nature of a human life. They were discussing death and the evils and the horrors of death and the evils that man undergoes when he is dead. The work of these poets is known as the graveyard poetry. Now, following these two, the steps of these two writers, appeared Thomas Gray in his elegy written in a country churchyard. Thomas Gray was one of the most enduring, famous, fluent, and diversified of all graveyard poets. His poetry offers both a scholarly tribute to Greek poetic form and an experimental interest in a new kind of subject, a tendency while attributing the Romantics. So his poetry was somehow a transitional type of poetry, moving or ranging between neoclassicism and romanticism, because his poetry including elements from neoclassical poets or poetry or writing, and elements from the romantic school. Gray's most famous work, which is Elegy, written in a country churchyard, reflects a taste for meditation and contemplation rather than action. The poem explains his sense of tradition, like his contemporary neoclassicist, and the historical continuity, like the romantic.